into English various quotes so you get a flavour of it. So he was explaining about the early days of learning the language and how they would attend to collect the nectar. And I'll just read it out so you get a flavour of it. In the morning and evening, the only time of day when the savages are at home, we would go up to the common house to learn a few words. The common house is, of course, the Nyarong, the big sort of sail-shaped house. Looks something very Polynesian, but actually it's very common right throughout the areas affected by Austronesians. Remember, the Chums are Austronesians who went right up into the highlands, so there's a lot of cultural elements transmitted up there. I think that's the origin of these big, spectacular common houses they have. There are a few things in this world as difficult as studying language without books, without a dictionary, without a grammar, without an interpreter, and especially when those who speak the language are poor savages with a narrow mind and an undeveloped intelligence. The savage will tell you how to name the visible object you point to. So very much a product of its time. These are the material, the historical materials we're working with. But please keep in mind these missionaries, they were very sincere in their effort to try to uplift these people in their view of things. So, and they were clearly having something of a hard time. Each of the missionaries held a pencil and a piece of paper in his hand. As soon as he thought he'd grasped the meaning of a word, wrote it down. Then, when the savages went off to their fields or retired to sleep, we would get together to compare notes and share what we had learned or thought we had learned. After a month and a half spent in Morden's house, we possessed a fairly large notebook of words, but these were mostly the least valuable. Now, I've pondered in my own mind what this might mean, and what I've come up with is the idea that, in fact, until they'd mastered the grammar, the words were more or less useless. So they set about not just putting together a lexicon, but also devising a grammar so they would have something useful, okay, in terms of making sense of the language and also being able to teach the language. And they produced a grammar. It's very much in European terms of the time, which is very much to be expected. But nonetheless, there's a lot of insight can be found from studying it. So dictionaries and grammars were printed in 1889, and they did make an effort to deal with the phonetics, but also parts of speech, word order, etc., etc. And we see the emergence here in print of an orthography in Roman script, and they're using characters such as the bridge to mark short vowels. There's macrons for long vowels. They seem to have been confused about whether there were 2 or 3 vowel lengths in Bahnar. And I think there's some phonotactic thing that I understand that confused them about how many vowel lengths there are. In fact, I think there's only 2. But from a phonotactic point of view, it can be confusing. And remember, these are not, linguists trained in structuralist methods. These are 19th century missionaries who trained in French and Latin and so forth. So they devised an initial orthography and produced grammar and lexicon in that. And later, Durismore revised and formalised the writing somewhat further. But he formalised writing in single and double letters and distinguished the use of double letters in some cases for clusters, but also in some cases for unitary sounds. And he explains in the material to his text. This is translated from his explanation that, for example, these sounds are to be pronounced as they are in Latin or French. That the X symbol is to be pronounced as in Vietnamese. That the KH is to be aspirated like the Greek. That the NH is a powerful like the Spanish, and so forth. So you can see their reference is always to European or established norms. This is pre-IPA. This is pre-structural linguistics. Pretty much normal 19th century methods. And I won't mention this, but there's also they're not just double letters for clusters and also for some complex unitary segments, but they're also clusters of 3 segments. So he's recognising, for example, that you have these deep voiced, pre-aspirated sonorants, as well as other clusters, and so we're starting to see something that's looking like the recognised contemporary description of phonology. And they continued their efforts, and by 1990, they actually established a college. They're now producing printed materials in orthography. I'd like to see the original photograph. This must have been a marvellous establishment in Kontum. So they established this Chinoa college and a print shop. And you see the name of this is the original French dialect of the establishment, and they had spelling with the K and Bahnar. And then so they established a publishing house, which was dedicated to printing entirely in Bahnar language, and they produced primers, lexicons, etc., and all sorts of teaching materials, including materials for teaching subjects like geography, mathematics, history. So this is a really sincere, full-on effort to provide a broad education. And this actually continued right through until the 1940s, when the area became more integrated into mainstream Vietnamese society. I will just break from the script for a moment just to relate that the first couple of times I went to Kontum and stayed with Bahnar people, I talked with old people who were there, and some of them were individuals who, as teenagers, in the 1930s, were sent to France for their education, for primary school and for high school education. And these are people who came of age before 1945, and that, as they explained to me, in their sensibility, they were citizens in the 1930s of citizens of metropolitan France. They regarded themselves as members of mainstream Western society. And to them, the geopolitical events that followed World War II were such that they were then cut away from this world that they previously felt integrated into and were educated into, and were now trapped in another world. And you can see that. So then these missionaries have made quite an impact. Now there were several spelling rounds of spelling changes, and the colonial government in the 20s and 30s was quite keen on having very standardised Romanisation. In particular, they picked several languages: Bahnar, Jarai, and also Kieu, and they wanted to have standardised spellings that they could use for all these languages, and so so they could expand these educational efforts, and you could produce materials that would be useful over a very wide area. And they, in particular, they struggled with how to capture the different sounds, because we couldn't just use Vietnamese conventions, because we have sounds, combinations of sounds that aren't in Vietnamese. We have vowel distinctions, in particular, long and short distinctions for all of the vowels, like Vietnamese. And as I said, it was also confusions about whether they should be distinguishing in more degrees of length vowels. So, and also there's some confusion about the central, the schwa-like vowel, whether they should be distinguishing more varieties of that. But you can see that they came up with some basic parameters for how to write these languages, and often again giving the comparisons in how you would read these sounds in French. Then this culminated in Yemen's huge 1959 two-volume dictionary. This dictionary was a bit of a breakthrough because it now distinguished quite consistently the pre-Romanized sonorants. So this, written with the range comma for the sonorant. In most of the previous attempts at orthography, they either didn't hear or just didn't write this globalization of sonorants. So the thing to keep in mind is that these languages have this pre-globalized versus plain sonorant series, and they also have implosive stops. So they have the sounds. And again, these are not consistently distinguished in previous orthographies, but now this is more or less consistently being distinguished in this 1959 dictionary, although the author does tell us he may not have got everything right. We also now have, coming into the Highlands, people who have very solid training in the structuralist linguistic background, and they're now systematically investigating. So George Condomino, for example, made quite an effort to check contrasts using the check phonemic contrast using the minimal pair approach, the thing we learned as undergraduates. And so just some examples here, but versus but, and versus which he writes these influences double letters, whereas the missionary approach was to use the tend to use the Vietnamese spellings. It's like using minimal pairs, he distinguishes all the vowels and the lengths, but he tends to write lengths, long vowels, for example, with a double vowel symbol, short single, whereas the missionary approach was generally to use single vowels, unmarked long, and to have the draft marked short. And then we have in the 60s and 70s, SIL, people such as Banker did a lot of work with Bahnar, and they tended to follow the conventions that earlier Catholic missionaries had developed. And then there have been developments more recently, so this is the last content slide. We'll just finish up on this one. So in is this the last one? No, okay. Second last. So since SIL left Vietnam, well, there were several attempts at describing the Bahnar language and coming up with ways of romanizing it. And here's one from 2008, and this is the description that's in the text. They try to distinguish, for example, glottalized sounds, where they might be glottalized with a plain B. Sorry, with a plain B, and then the plain B, they transcribe BV, and you see the plain D, they transcribe with the fricative symbol. In fact, in some varieties of Bahnar, the plain BD can be a little bit fricativized. So it's not clear exactly which variety of Bahnar we're dealing with here, but it looks like this particular source is a combination of previous Catholic-inspired sources, and one of the jobs in our project we did to work out which varieties Bahnar informed which attempts at devising Romanized writing. 2008, there was an onwards, there was government support for teaching in minority languages in parts of Vietnam. And so a lot of material started to be developed. And then not long after, the situation changed and that was made optional. And a lot of the schools gave up and devoted those resources to teaching something else they thought might be more useful, like English or computer science. But as I mentioned at the beginning, the Bahnar community is very vital and strong, and they continue their teaching in Bahnar. And this most recent textbook from 2016, you can see here, and here's part of its explanation for the use of romanization. Now, again, they're giving good favour to conventions that are consistent with Vietnamese spelling principles. But again, the spelling choices will depend on which variety of Bahnar is actually reflected, because Bahnar can be quite internally diverse, and that's one of the topics of the research that we'll be trying to follow through on. So just to finish up, so we're developing a history of the use of Romanized script for Bahnar. We're trying to understand the spelling choices being made. It often depends on the people who created, the people on the ground, what their understanding of the phonetics were. And this can be affected by which variety of the language they're dealing with, but also policy and politics can be involved. For example, do you make choices that favour the use of Vietnamese conventions, or do you use conventions that people themselves come up with? And then we'll also try to synthesize some general lessons from the whole experience. And I'll stop there and take questions and comments.